Welcome to GRE. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. What happens when a pandemic hits an international business and things don't go as planned? That's what happened to investment in Panama coffee farms, like we discussed on the show in the past. An update now, and what exactly happens when operations go sideways, and how good are you at handling it today on episode 431 of the GRE podcast. Mid-South homebuyers with over 2 decades as the nation's highest-rated turnkey provider, their empathetic property managers use your return on investment as their North Star. It's no wonder smart investors line up to get their completely renovated income properties like it's the newest iPhone. Headquartered in Memphis with their globally attractive cash flows, Mid-South has an A-plus rating with the Better Business Bureau and 4,000 houses renovated. There is zero markup on maintenance, let that sink in, and they average a 98.9% occupancy rate with an industry-leading 3.5-year average renter term. Every home they offer you will have brand new components, a bumper-to-bumper 1-year warranty, new 30-year roofs, and wait for it, a high-quality renter in an astounding price range, $100 to $150K. Get to know Mid-South. Enjoy cash flow from day one at midsouthhomebuyers.com. That's midsouthhomebuyers.com.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from Oswego, New York to Lake Oswego, Oregon, and across 188 nations worldwide. I'm Keith Weinhold. Wealthy people's money either starts out or ends up in real estate, and that's why we discuss it so often here. But there's one particular investment where you can get both land appreciation and annual cash flow returns from Panama coffee farms. And investors did exactly that for a few years, but then the returns stopped flowing. So what happened? You're going to see why the pandemic threw them a taller speed bump than it did for a lot of other industries, and there were some other problems too. And this is not normal. I don't know that this has ever happened with any GRE marketplace provider. And you might find today's show of particular interest because if you're a newer listener, you're going to see how we handle when problems occur here at GRE. I like to get things out there and have them be explained. And if you're a longtime listener, you might be one of dozens or maybe hundreds that have been on a Panama coffee farm tour. And some of you were with me on the ground in Central America for one of those. Now, coffee farm returns are expected to be slow in the early years. That's just part of the model when the coffee trees are younger and aren't yet yielding much fruit. But as they grow, the projected long-term returns look amazing. And as a philosophy, I think you know that I prefer investments that cater to a basic human need, like housing and food. Consumer needs are more recession resilient. Consumer options are less so. Another thing that attracted me to this is the easy ability to invest in another nation. Coffee is also uncorrelated with things like interest rates and other financial markets. The S&P 500 was down, or the yield on the 10-year T-note soared. Well, the coffee trees don't know it. They just keep growing every day. They show up and know what to do. Really, this is something that I've been following for 9, perhaps even 10 years before they began this company in Panama, because their co-founder already had a proof of concept for this model in Colombia prior to this, and then they began growing coffee near the village of Boquete. That's a place that has a lot of expat appeal in Western Panama. It has been 4 years since we had them on the show for a few reasons. As you'll see, they've had a number of operational problems to adjust to, and they also haven't had any new farms available in years. Things really began going sideways for them in 2019. I'll be sure this gets discussed, as you'll learn the nation of Panama was really restrictive during the pandemic, more so than the U.S. And I am an investor in this myself. Part of the reason is that because it's different enough from other investments, that I want to understand this journey from the inside so that I can better help you. Where are the deeds? Why have the issuance of the coffee farm deeds to their hundreds of investors been slow as well? We'll get into that. Now, me as the founder of this platform and singular host of this show since its inception, I could be handling this in a different way, maybe sweeping it under the rug since this investment has had some problems and just moving on and forgetting about it. But no, that's not helpful to you. And that's just not always how life works or how anything works. As you journey through life, not everything is as idealistic and balanced and flawless and pristine as you always think that it's going to be. I mean, any experienced real estate investor knows that. Maybe in your life, you had the dream girl who got away and she even liked you, but the timing wasn't right. You might have had the dream home getaway because someone outbid you and you're still kicking yourself years later. That is just how life goes. So we're talking to one of the two co-founders of the Panama Coffee Farms today, and both of these guys are stand-up guys. In my experience with them, that goes back quite a few years, when they have a problem, they are transparent about it, and they typically have a plausible explanation, and then they find a solution. One is Canadian, one is Irish. We're talking to the Irish one today. Both have lived in Panama long-term now. And from day one, they've had a socially sustainable model. They are savvy business people. They often hold tours so you can meet them and see the coffee plantations and see the operation. And they love it when you ask them questions. You can even see inside the homes of the coffee farm workers. All of those things that I just mentioned, I have done in person. And they are quite willing to discuss their operational problems and how they have since tuned things up accordingly. They wanted to come on the show today. Before we discuss the Panama coffee farms and their problems, some of the vernacular that could be used today on this show that residential and commercial real estate investors usually don't understand is that we're talking about high-end specialty coffee growing types here, which include varieties that you might have heard of like geisha and what is known as a Q grader. A Q grader, they are basically the wine sommelier equivalent to the coffee industry. So they're sort of a fine-flavored coffee connoisseur. Green coffee, that really just means unroasted coffee. And then for U.S. listeners, there are about 2.5 acres in a hectare. Before we get into that, I am in the largest city in America's Mojave Desert today. I just arrived here last week, and I am spending a total of at least 1 full month here. If you haven't figured out where that is, yes, that is Greater Las Vegas, Nevada, Henderson, Nevada, to be more specific. I have family that lives here in Henderson. They are going through some hard times, so I have been working to set up and establish sort of a temporary GRE studio here. That's what I've been working on in the past week. So yeah, I've got some family going through some hard times, including a family member that, sorry to say, is terminally ill. And from a distance, I can do and have done support phone calls and Zoom calls and messages. And I can tell loved ones that I love you and I care all that I want from a distance. But well, I decided that the best thing to do was to be there. I've learned that really this just isn't the type of decision that you end up regretting. It's just not that sort of thing. It's not about what's convenient or best for me all the time. So I'm going to be there and help out, or be here in this case. Nothing beats being there. A few weeks ago on the show, I let you know that coming up, we were going to discuss a geographic market that might surprise you, a market that we've never discussed and you didn't think we would. Well, that's not what this show is today. That's a different show coming up in a few weeks. Today, let's discuss Panama coffee farm investing, what went wrong, and the future promise. This week's guest was born and raised in Dublin, Ireland. He's lived in a number of nations since, but he settled down in Panama 10 years ago, and he spent the last 8 years offering outside investors the opportunity to participate alongside his company as passive investors in turnkey managed specialty coffee farms in Panama. He's the co-founder and president of the Agronosotros group of companies. It's been about 4 years since you were last here. Welcome back to GRE, Darren Doyle.
Hey, Keith. Thanks for having me back. Yeah, time flies. It's been 4 years now.
Oh, and it's so good to have your charming Irish accent back here on the show. And, well, some might wonder, oh, why was there a 4-year absence? So, yeah, let's go ahead and get caught up on that, Darren.
Well, number one, I think when we met first, it was back in 2014, 2015, we were getting the company started, and we were an investment company. We were going to investment trade shows, going on investment podcasts, raising capital to start the company, to buy the assets and buy the farms and build everything up. And by 4 years ago, when we stopped, we had closed out our 11th coffee farm. And quite frankly, we had quite a lot of work to do. So we decided to hold off on buying any more farms and focus on developing the farms that we actually had. So we had 11 farms. They all had to be fully planted. They had to be developed. We had to develop a brand. We had to develop a channel to market. So over the last few years, you're more than likely to see us at a coffee conference than an investment conference. So up until now, we haven't had any coffee farms available. So we've been focusing on developing the brand and developing the farms.
Yeah, for a while, you kind of hung out in real estate investor circles. And in the past few years, you added the food circles there, since you are, of course, growing and raising coffee on these coffee farms. You developed those 11 farms, and you grew into having more than 550 investors throughout your farms there. So congratulations on that. And yeah, why don't we recap some of those last few years? Again, since it has been 4 years since you were here, just some of those highs and some of those lows, including the projections and the reality.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this. Every time we meet somebody new and you start telling them where you've come from, you actually realize how much has happened. So
right.
The first few years, getting started off the ground obviously had its challenges. And once we got up and running from kind of 2015, everything was plain sailing. It was every year we bought another farm or another couple of farms. Every year the coffee got better. Coffee sold for a better price. Deals were flowing. We were going to trade shows and everything was going great. And then the universe decides to give you a reality check and you realize that, life throws you a few curveballs. And then I guess it's kind of like a bit of a proof of concept to see if your business model really is sustainable. So by about, I think so 2015, 16, 17, 18, everything was good. So if you were receiving distributions, you got your deed, we were getting a better sales price for the coffee year on year. And then around 2019, all of a sudden, a few challenges, deeds were coming a little bit slower. Older coffee trees needed to be replaced a little bit sooner than forecast. Newer coffee trees were taking a little bit longer to produce the first crop than forecast. And now all of a sudden you're dealing with the delta that you hadn't figured out, you hadn't planned. But we were good because we'd always been good savers. We'd been listening to yourself and Peter Schiff and Kiyosaki, and we were always preparing for a big recession anyway. We didn't realize it was going to be in the form of a pandemic, but we were well saved. So we had plenty of operating capital saved up and everything. But then when the pandemic came along, that was our biggest test, because then all the revenue pretty much stopped. I don't know if we want to go into the detail of how lockdown Panama was, but for about 8 or 9 months, I was allowed to leave my apartment on a Tuesday and a Thursday from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m.
Gosh,
and that was it.
Talk about a restriction.
And the whole country had their hour that they were allowed out, and men and women were allowed out on different days. So as you can imagine, not much work got done in the country. Most of the companies in the country closed down and furloughed their staff, but you can't stop farming your coffee farms. You have to keep farming. We went through a couple of years where the revenue had completely stopped because there was no sales, at least for a year. And then it got hard and we got another container eventually into Japan. But we got to keep paying the bills. So we really pride ourselves on our social sustainability. And that was really put to the test. We had made sure that everybody got paid because they relied on us. We obviously trimmed some of our overheads, did like a lot of people, got rid of a couple of offices, we're working from home, the whole adaptation that most people made. And it was probably a good little shakeout to remind you that you needed to tighten the belt, and a good proof of concept that the farms could withstand something like this, that the product was non-perishable and was able to be stored and wait to be sent, and that we were able to stick by our word and keep paying the staff and keep everybody employed.
Sure, those operational expenses continue despite a pandemic. Of course, all 8 billion dwellers of Earth got thrown for a substantial loop in early 2020. And that manifested itself in a few ways with the coffee farms. It prevented you from making some shipments, which shouldn't matter too much in a sense because coffee is not perishable. But yet when those coffee beans are seen as old on the market, they have less market value, for example. And then you also had some climate difficulties.
Yeah, it was a double whammy. So people would ask us, how did COVID affect the coffee farms? And my short answer kind of would be it didn't, because the coffee trees were oblivious to what was going on.
Right.
We just had to change some of the farming practices to stop the farmers mixing among the farms and keep everybody safe. But what happened was we were just ready to ship a container of green coffee to Japan. And because the Japan wouldn't accept anything, obviously, at the start, and Japan we couldn't send it. So we just covered the container and stored it correctly. And it was there for, I think, until November. So maybe March through to November, we just had to pack it up and let it wait. And then we shipped it, and it took 3 or 4 months to get to Japan. And by the time it arrived, it was kind of a unique phenomenon. There's never normally been 2 coffee harvests on the market at the same time. So normally all the coffee every year is sold pretty much all over the world. And in specialty coffee, although the coffee was still good, it has what they would call like an old papery taste that me and you wouldn't really maybe know, but a Q grader that's paying top dollars for the coffee could recognize. So right. We ended up with, like, was it 2020's coffee was on the market at the same time that 2021's coffee was on the market, and who was the buyer going to buy? So we ended up selling it for still above the C market price, but a little bit less than what we'd hoped. So that was the logistics side of things. And then just to keep things fun, there was a unique phenomenon where there's been a shift in weather patterns all over Central and South America lately. There's rainfall when there normally wasn't rainfall, and more rainfall at certain times of year. And there was a unique fungus that normally isn't a problem. It's just part of the ecosystem, but because it mutated and there was heavy rain, I won't go into the details of it, but basically there was a 60 to 75% drop in coffee production around the region. So now, apart from the producing farms giving us less coffee and not being able to sell the coffee at the same time, it was a challenging couple of years.
Yeah, completely. You have regular ongoing operational expenses for producing and marketing the coffee, of course. And then you have those socially sustainable programs that were also put to the test during COVID. And I know that you do a lot of things. You don't like to lay people off. You're trying to produce jobs there in that region of Western Panama, where the coffee farms are centered, including making sure that people don't get cataracts in their eyes and they don't have to heat things with a wood-burning stove for their food anymore. And I have been inside some of those homes where you've improved and upgraded the living conditions for a lot of the people that work right there on site. But that was put to the test too.
Yeah, so when everything was going good and we were helping them with their housing and everything was rosy, when COVID came along, because Panama, probably like most of the countries, the government shut down the businesses. So most companies furloughed their employees. And unlike in the United States, where you got your checks either as a business or personal to keep you going, in Panama, the companies got zero assistance. And the people got 1 bag of food and $100 per family per month. And most of the families are, 4, 5, 6 people.
Gosh.
Imagine. So, and a lot of our employees are these sole breadwinners for their homes. So whether they work in our coffee shop or farmers kept going anyway because they were busy. We had to keep everyone else employed and make sure that they had repurposed them with something to do, or some of them just got to get paid and stay at home and help in other ways, or we got some English classes for them to improve their English online and tried to keep the morale going. But yeah, it's socially sustainable. It's easy to say, tougher to do, but we're glad to say that we were able to do it. And I think we've a very loyal group of people after the fact.
Well, you brought up the deeds earlier, Darren. Previously, many of your 550 plus investors were to be issued deeds when they went ahead and purchased coffee farm parcels. And there were some delays in issuing the deeds. I know, as an investor myself, it probably took me a year or 2 to get the deeds. Bring us up to date on the deeds, since that's caused a fair bit of consternation among some of the investors.
Yeah. When you do a SWOT analysis and you look back on how things, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats, and if you're honest with yourself and you say what's going well and what's not going well, the deeds was not as forecast. So we have delivered them. I think 50% of the people have their deeds in hands, and there's another 50% to go, but we are behind where we're supposed to be. In the annual report, I named them the dreaded deeds because it's the one thing, apart from the weather, it's very hard for us to impact it any further. I try to remind people this Boquete is a small town in Latin America with 25,000 people, and there's a small little government run office with 2 or 3 little old ladies that are processing these things. It's not like a big office in New York where there's hundreds of people working. And there was a couple of things that happened. So when we started 2014, we met the lawyers and we asked if we could do it and how long the time frame would be, and they said, yeah, no problem, take about a year. Okay, so manage expectations, we said 18 months. Then a couple of things happened. Other companies started doing what we were doing, and some of them quite a bit bigger than us. The government decentralized set the deeding departments from the city and set them up in the rural locations, but without any advance notice. So there was nothing set up in the rural locations. Simple things like that cost us 6 months. But I think basically the volume of the amount of deeds between ourselves and the other companies was just unexpected. And these small little towns are overloaded. They will literally only accept one farm at a time. I'll give you an example. We had, just before the pandemic, we submitted a farm. There was 30 or 40 investors in it. We got all the documentation printed out. They don't accept digital signature, so everything has to be FedEx to the US, wet signature, FedEx back, officially translated, gather it all together, submit it, accept it. 2 or 3 months through them working through it, they find one passport that has since expired after the fact. They put the entire farm on for hold until the guy renews his passport. He wasn't in a hurry to renew his passport. So long story short, that simple thing caused about a 4 or 5 month delay. And they just sat on it and wouldn't accept another farm. So when we were looking back and seeing what we could do, we're committed to it. As I said, we've done 50% of the deeds. We will do the rest of them. It's way more expensive on our parts for administrative wise to be able to do it. It is a pain point. It is slower for the investors to be able to get it. We are back up and running since the pandemic. We've completed 2 new farms and issued the deed since the pandemic. And now we're going to finish the Jaramillo region. But one thing we are not doing going forward is digging the hole any deeper. And that's why we switched towards the private placement model.
All right. So the issuance of deed was muddied because they had been issued at the national level, and then they provincialized that deed issuance. And then this is some proof of concept for you. You have other competitors that are creating models similar to your model where one can invest alongside you in coffee farms. That created more of a need for more deed issuance, and that slowed things down. But you have since pivoted from that, so you're not adding to the backlog of deeds like you told us about. So tell us about the model that you're using going forward for the coffee farms, Darren.
One of the main reasons for the change was the deeds. Another one was 2 or 3 years before we sold out the last farm, there was a couple of changes in the requirements from the IRS as regards clients who had invested with their self-directed IRAs or any kind of a retirement plan. And your typical, if you invested with Equity Trust, it'd say on the deed would say Equity Trust FBO Darren Doyle, da-da-da-da-da. Panama stopped accepting that. They only wanted to have one name. Who's the final beneficial owner?
Okay, Equity Trust, one of these IRA custodians for direct investing through one's IRA.
Yeah, so any one of the companies, the format that the name would be on the contract because it's for benefit of you, right? Panama basically didn't understand it, couldn't guarantee that we would be able to get the deed process, so we stopped accepting funds from people that were using their IRA just because, in an abundance of caution, because I don't want to take the funds and in 2 years' time I'm talking to you saying I can't deliver because they've changed something, blah, blah, blah. So using IRA funds was actually a very good use of funds for this type of an investment because it takes time to get started, it's slow building, it's legacy, and it was a really good fit for IRA funds. So it was a shame to have to not be able to take it anymore. So when you added the delays in the deeds to the fact that we weren't allowed to be able to take the IRA funds, it made sense to switch to another model. So from talking to some of our other colleagues, they do other syndications and they structure them as a 506B or a 506C private placement. I was a bit dubious at the start because one of the biggest selling points when we started in 2014-15 was offshore hard asset. That was what everybody was looking for. But we rolled out a syndication in the teeth of the pandemic, and it was a 506B private placement, $3 million raise, but it was shares in a standalone entity that owned the assets versus a deed. And it sold great. And some of the experienced investors actually preferred it because there's a lot more information provided, much more deeper financial projections, sources and uses of funds. So for an experienced investor, they found it better. They preferred it. I understand some of the newer investors that are maybe a little bit shy about foreign countries and like the idea of the deed would prefer that. But based on past performance, we weren't going to offer that again, at least until we finish the backlog. So we've now done 3 or 4 private placements, probably to a tune of about $20 million. And so far, so good.
All right. And I know that your current model and the model that you're using going forward that doesn't take any deed issuance, that's also compatible with the EQRP, that retirement vehicle that's increased in popularity. Well, Darren and I have more to discuss, including their new distribution partner that could potentially pay them higher prices for the coffee beans that they sell, and just maybe a new coffee farm. You're listening to Get Rich Education. Our guest is Darren Doyle. More when we come back. We're talking about Panama coffee. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. If you're looking to grow your passive income from real estate, pay attention. My Property Stats is a deal analysis tool developed by an active investor to cut the time it takes to analyze any deal by over 90%. For any real estate class, you can calculate the exact price to pay to hit your cash flow and IRR goals. Build a world-class pro forma. Calculate the most you should pay for a renovation. Run multiple scenarios with a comparison tool and more. My Property Stats is the all-in-one toolkit for real estate investors. That means more deals, more cash flow, and more returns. Go to mypropertystats.com/GRE now and use the coupon code GRE to get 10% off your first year. That's just $90 a year for a tool that can save 10 hours per deal. No more spreadsheets, no more juggling multiple files. Use coupon code GRE to get 10% off at mypropertystats.com/GRE. GRE listeners can't stop talking about their service from Ridge Lending Group and MLS 42056. They've provided our tribe with more loans than anyone. They're truly a top lender for beginners and veterans. It's where I go to get my own loans for single-family rental property up to 4plexes. So start your pre-qualification and you can chat with President Chaley Ridge personally. They'll even deliver your custom plan for growing your real estate portfolio. Start at ridgelendinggroup.com.
This is Rich Dad Advisor Tom Wheelwright. Listen to Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold and don't quit your daydream.
Welcome back to Get Rich Education. We're talking about a really interesting and exotic investment today, generating yield potentially from coffee farms in Central America, specifically the highlands of Panama is what we're talking about here. So when your coffee cherries, which basically turn into beans, are grown, of course, they need to get a certain price out there on the market to help ensure profits. So we're talking about specialty coffee here, not just your average coffee, a coffee type that can demand a premium. And I know that you have a new Japanese-based distribution partner named Typica that's potentially making a lot of these future purchases. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so Typica has been probably one of the highlights that in the last couple of years. They're a distribution company. Their goal is to kind of revolutionize the way the green coffee industry works. One of the problems, everybody knows coffee is a $200 billion industry at this stage, but all the coffee farmers are still poor. So something not right there, right? And that's part of our business model and philosophy to make sure that people get the best price. So Typica's business model is they've got the technology, which is an online platform that connects the roaster directly to the producer. And then they got the logistics systems in place to make it feasible to send small amounts of coffee around the world to these roasters and basically cut out all the middlemen that were making the farmers starve and keeping all the profits from themselves. So they found us during the pandemic, got to know each other, sent samples. They loved our business model. David and Daniele and Deborah, David Sewell, my partner and co-founder, his wife Deborah, and Daniele Leverato, our COO, just got back from Typica's AGM over in Tokyo, which I thought was great. They invited all of their producers and flew us all out to Tokyo to attend their AGM so they could tell us about their plans for the future and how they're going. So we sent 4 containers, not full, but 4 containers of our green coffee went out at the end of last year, 1 to Amsterdam, 1 to Korea, 1 to Taiwan and 1 to Tokyo. And from there, they distribute to the roasters. They buy it directly from us, FOB the farm gate. We engage with the roasters via Zooms, information on the online cupping and grading of the coffee and getting to know the roasters, getting feedback from the roasters, which is invaluable as well from us. And then Typica puts our green coffees available online, basically. So they have 2 ways of doing it. We set the price that we want for the coffee. FOB, the farm gate. They mark it up, obviously make some money for themselves, but they list the coffees on the website. Half of them they listed for a flat price and people just bought them. The other half, the higher end coffees like the geishas, they listed as a silent auction or a blind auction, and people got to bid and whoever got the highest price. So we got considering the C market rate was just under $2 a pound. And
the C market rate, just meaning common everyday coffee.
Commodity coffee. If you're looking at Bloomberg or anything and you see the coffee price, you think that's the price of coffee worldwide, but that's the price of commercial coffee. Specialty coffee is based on if you score 80 points or above, and then supply and demand and cupping and grading and opinion on where you're from. So at our very first appearance on the Typica platform, nobody really knew who we were. All of our coffee sold out in record time. Some of our geisha sold for a record price. So we sold what we call the standard specialty coffee for $5 and $6 and $7 a pound. We sold some Pacamaras for $8 and $12 a pound, and the geisha for $30 and 75 cents a pound. So quite a significant increase. And the biggest thing about the deal with Typica is we received 100% of that because they paid farm. Whereas if you take the previous example where we talked briefly about sending container to Japan, as a new coffee company, even though we've got 175 hectares all planted, our coffee volume is pretty low because most of the new farms are still waiting to produce. So when we go and talk to a big distributor, they might love our coffee, but we haven't got enough coffee to send them what they want. So it's a little bit chicken and the egg. So in 2020 and 2021, we said we'll do it ourselves. So we identified some distributors in Japan that were, through contacts that we had, that were familiar and experienced in importing goods from Europe and Central America into Japan. And we set up a distribution company with them to promote and sell our coffee. So we loaded the coffee in the container in Boquete. We had to pay the land transportation, the international shipping, the export fees, the duties. When it got to Japan, we had to pay the import duties. We had to pay the storage. We had to pay the staff. We had to pay the shipping. We had to pay the taxes. And by the time we sold the coffee, wasn't an awful lot left. And that was fine. We knew that going in with our eyes open, but to gain market share and get into the market, you consider it a cost of doing business, right? So we did that a couple of times by ourselves, and then Typica came along, and you can imagine the difference then. We got 100% of the FOB price at the farm gate. Typica sent a truck to pick up with a container to pick up all the coffee. And from there, between them and our distribution partner, they split it up, sent it to those 4 countries you mentioned, and from there split it up even further and sent it out to all the roasters. So it really, by having a distribution partner and a sales partner that can market and sell the coffee for above the prices that we forecast, turnkey at no cost to us, really gives us the best price we can get and allows us to focus on the farming and the development and improvement of the coffee.
Right, so being on the Typica platform allows you to diversify your distribution options, potentially get you a better price rather than having all of your eggs in one basket. And we are talking about international trading of coffee here, the second most traded commodity in the world to oil. So it is a substantial, robust market that you're able to participate in at a high level there that way. As you, the listener here, are thinking about these farms in your mind's eye, often there are a number of smaller farms here and there around Western Panama, close to Boquete. And I've got to tell you, these are just some of the most beautiful verdant green landscapes that I have ever seen when we did our GRE coffee farm tour there in, I believe it was November of 2015, in the highlands of tropical Panama, where you have all these green trees and these creeks running through verdant valleys. And I seem to see trees with flowering with things I've never seen before, some of the most exotic plants I've ever seen in my life, and just this beautiful greenscape in Western Panama, where you have a number of these coffee farms. Do you have any new coffee farms coming online?
We do, actually. So for the first time since 4 years ago, we just acquired a new farm. It's actually very typical of the type of farmer that's selling. Everybody in Boquete has the same microclimate, the same natural conditions, the volcanic soil, all the things that make Panama unique in producing some of the best coffee in the world. But not all of them run their farms like a business. Only a small percentage, maybe 4 or 5 families run their farm like a business where they know their numbers. They manage their inputs versus their outputs. They know when to rotate the coffee. They know how to market. They have channels to market. The other ones, I guess it's like a lot of farmers worldwide, not unique to coffee, where the younger generations don't want to live in the small town. They don't want to be in farming. They want to move to the US and be a lawyer or live in California, whatever they want to do. So you end up with all these older farmers that don't have the capital or the motivation or maybe the energy to maintain their farms. So you end up then with older farms with older cherries and older trees, and these guys are looking for a way to retire. So we had a realtor who helped us identify probably 10 of the 11 farms that we bought. And he owned some farms, some land that was contiguous with a big group of our farms up in Jaramillo. And he's getting old and he's not great. And he came to us to see if we could help him to sell. So we put a deal together to take on the farm. It's another good example, I guess, of how some of these guys are running the farm. It's a 22-hectare farm. He has 10,500 trees already planted. So geisha and pacamara, high-end, high-value trees. But he hasn't planted them a little bit all over the place because it's been a side hobby of his. It hasn't been a full-time thing where he's doing it the way we would do it. So the great news for us is that it's contiguous with 2 of our farms. So the more land you can own together, the more protection you have, economies of scale,
Great.
access, being able to build roads to go through, protection from the elements and other farmers. And it's already planted. Some of the coffee trees on it are already 3 years old. So it gives us a 3-year head start on the coffee that's already planted. But there's also enough raw land or unplanted land left for us to be able to develop the rest of the farm the way we want.
So you, the investor, you're not always waiting for seeds or saplings to grow. You're not always starting from zero, though sometimes you are, and that certainly affects the sort of return you can get and when your schedule of returns might be. And I know you've planted more than 10,000 trees on that new farm.
Yeah, so there was already 10,500 trees there when we acquired it. So now we're going to plant maybe another 40 or 50,000. So when we did the annual report to the investors in October, we had about 516,000 trees. So you can add another 45 or 50,000 onto that.
This is typically shade-grown coffee in this volcanic soil. Oftentimes, I know you're on the slopes of Volcan Baru there in western Panama. So just have these rows of everything that's in uniform height. Oftentimes, these are in hill country, and you keep a variety of foliage there to help provide the shade for the shorter coffee trees.
Yeah, and so you hear people talking about shade-grown coffee, and
right.
I guess your average person, listen, if they think of a coffee farm, they might have an image of Brazil or Vietnam, and it's just thousands and thousands of hectares of just rows of coffee and machines going up and down. And that's commercial sun-grown coffee, and it's done by machines, and it's monoculture. If you look at our farms, I would describe the development farms as a raw land farm in our previous projects. And when people turn up, it looks more like a jungle or like the rainforest than actually raw land. It just means it wasn't farmed before. So the shade is amazing because if you were to develop that shade, some of those trees are over 100 years old. So shade-grown coffee is the perfect environment for growing it. One of the issues we're having at the moment, and we've taken this into account with this new offering, is sometimes there was too much shade. And then there was a lot of cloud cover, and then there was a lot of rain. And what happens when the coffee reacts to stress, solar stress and then hydric stress, and that's what makes it grow and produce. They don't produce cherries so we can have our cup of joe in the morning, right? So they react to these stresses, and when there was too much shade, they get too comfortable, and they actually don't develop as fast as you would like. So that's one of the things we have to take into account, always learning. So shade is good, too much shade, not so good. So now our saplings are old enough that we're in a stage that we're able to start opening up the canopy once we get permission from some of the local authorities. You can't just cut down anything that you want. But yeah, shade-grown coffee is excellent. We're learning now too much shade, not so good.
So it's not completely like you're walking through a thick forest and then you go look over there and you're like, oh, there are a couple coffee trees as well. So it's not like that, but it's also not a monoculture example where everything's just the same in these neat uniform rows and everything's the same height. It's sort of a hybrid perhaps between those two scenarios that I just described there.
You can see the uniform rows amongst the canopy. So when they're baby saplings, it's hard for you to see it. But if you go on our website and go through some of the photos of all of the farms and you can see them, there are very clearly designed horizontal rows of coffee that are spaced 1 meter apart with and another 3 meters apart for lots of specific reasons. So you don't overcrowd and they have room to grow and easier to farm. And they're planted horizontally, so it prevents against erosion. So it is very organized once you know what you're looking for. But if you were to just take a big picture of the forest, especially with the saplings, it can be a bit hard to see.
And we're talking about Andres, one of the managers whom I have met in person a few times. So Agrinosotros is a company. They don't just come into an area and, assume they know everything or just going to apply what they learn in books. They actually hire with and partner people that were born and raised there in that coffee growing culture in Panama, like whom is exemplary of Andres here in this case. Thank you so much for talking about some of the risks, some of the hardships that you've dealt with, what you're doing to adjust to those, and the potential opportunity in the future. If this sounds of interest to you as a listener or viewer here, you just want to start with learning more and potentially taking a look at some of the returns, you can do that at our GRE Marketplace page. That is at gremarketplace.com/coffee. That's gremarketplace.com/coffee. And Darren, I know that you still organize group tours.
Actually, I just sent out an email this weekend announcing that our group tours are back. Obviously, for obvious reasons, during the pandemic, they'd stopped. Then last year, I sent a few emails, but there wasn't that much of an interest of people mixing in groups of strangers anymore. So we've done private tours all this year. I sent out an email this weekend and it got swamped. So yeah, we have a group tour in March. The dates, I can send them to you. They can put them in a link below. So first group tour in March, another group tour in May. Like I say to people, you can read all the PPM docs, all the emails, all the financial projections. You can read all of that to your heart's content. Being in country, and because you've been on the tours, walking the farm, talking to Andres, seeing firsthand the people that it impacts, seeing the assets and infrastructure that are in place, and tasting the quality of the coffee. That's pretty much the best due diligence you can do. And not a bad country to visit. You can add on some trips to some white sandy beaches or go hike the volcano, which I still owe you a hike up the volcano next time you're back. But lots for you to do. And the origin tours are back, happy to say.
Darren is referencing when I was there in November of 2015 for a GRE group tour that we had there. Me and another GRE follower climbed Volcan Baru, which is actually the lower slopes of where some of the coffee grows, but that is also the highest point in Panama, the highest mountain. So just something that I had to go do, of course. So I really recommend, if this is potentially of interest to you, it is just a really cool tour. It's a great vacation. Your base is Panama City, which is where you fly into, which is a really cosmopolitan city in itself, and the canal is nearby as well. But you really want to spend time out there in Western Panama in the highlands where this shade-grown coffee is. Darren, this has been a great update. Do you have any just last thoughts on the state of the union for you and your enterprise going forward?
If you're investing in agriculture, you're subject to weather. We all got affected by the pandemic, but you're subject to these type of things. And it was good to talk about the realities versus the pro forma. And it was nice to see that we've come out the other side. And I think you learn more about things that go wrong than things that go well, right? So I think we're doing well. Happy to say that we have a new farm that we're accepting new investors. How I would sum it up, we have all the assets and infrastructure in place. We have 12 coffee farms now. 11 are 100% planted. We've everything in place, as in the nursery, the post-harvest facility, the brand is established, the team are in place and trained and loyal. We have a distribution partner in Typica that just there last week said they want 3 times the amount of coffee that they took last year, which will be almost all of our crop this year.
Great.
We are not going to have all our eggs in one basket, so we are talking to other people that do work similar to Typica, and we have the local market, but the channel to market and stuff is in place. I'm not saying we're finished learning, but I think we've learned a lot. We've got a lot built. And if you're interested in coming on board, click the links that Keith provides, and I'm happy to send you some material, talk to you, and see if this is a good fit for you.
It really is fascinating. They have a lot of the operation in-house, like their own processing plant, which is called a beneficio, and then a laboratory where you do the grading and cupping of the coffee. That's part of your tour too. It's just really fascinating to learn about, and just really rewarding to see trees and then drink coffee that comes from those same trees. So it's been super interesting to talk about this, Darren. Again, if you as an investor are potentially interested in this or just want to learn more, understand that you are going to be well diversified, but understand some of the very real risks that we discussed, and then the rewards from the annual production of cash flow that comes from that coffee product. Darren, it's been fascinating to talk about this. Thanks so much for coming back onto the show.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me back.
This provider was featured at a lot of real estate and investing events a few years ago. I was there at the New Orleans Investment Conference in about 2017 when Robert Kiyosaki and others had visited their booth there. To summarize, the three big problems that we discuss is that they got thrown for a real pandemic loop, erratic weather, and Panama's change to the deed issuance process. So they just changed their model and stopped having to issue the deeds. And now they have a new distribution and sales model that can get them better prices. For individual investors, don't expect to be able to get loans for foreign agricultural investments like this. But as you'll see, if you decide that you'd like to learn more, you're going to find that there is quite a low cost of entry for individual investors like you. Their tours are fascinating and among the top of the top, the very best real estate tours I have ever attended. You not only get to see the coffee parcels, but you go into the coffee, what's called the cupping laboratory, and you see all the varieties in there, and you taste the coffees, and you get to see what makes for the different grades of coffee. They also have a retail coffee shop in Boquete and a lot of other parts of their business. And though if you go on the tour, you might not treat the tour completely like a vacation, though. Considering the business that they're in, you might only go if you're potentially interested in investing, although you sure don't have to. Well, as much as anything, today's episode is a follow-up for you with this provider that we had on a few times in the past, and perhaps this investment was cash flowing to you like it was to me, and then it stopped for a while, and it's been interesting to learn why. Hey, this is what can happen in a once-in-a-century black swan pandemic. If this sounds interesting to you, proceed slowly, check it out, and maybe even go on a tour. You can get all the details at gremarketplace.com/coffee. Until next week, when we bring things back onto domestic shores for U.S. residents, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.